Welcome, everybody. I'm Stephen Hinkle. I'm presenting for Dr. Danforth's class on disability history, and I'm presenting on the history of autism. And we're going to take a look at from the days of eugenics all the way to the era now of neurodiversity and cover some of the events that happened over the course of I'd say probably 3/4 of a century in terms of the way autism has been viewed and how things have changed over time in terms of the views and some of the old beliefs, and we'll go up to some of the new movements that are happening recently. So I will start by starting out, and it's interesting. A lot of the early researchers came from Austria and Austria-Hungary, as it was called back then. One of Eugen Bleuler was one of the first founders of the thing, who believed in a little bit of eugenics. He believed in that autism was derived from schizophrenia. And then later on, the works of Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, both working separately, by the way, would eventually do this. I believe Kanner gets a job at Johns Hopkins. I believe Asperger does some stuff in different parts of Europe in terms of how the research for autism, and they've been noticing that they had a lot of kids with poor social abilities and poor spatial and unusual interests and a bunch of other things as well. But later these would eventually get merged into autism spectrum disorder, but back then it was a very different scenario. So one of the things I think is so important is to understand things. And originally, Buer was believed in from Switzerland, first concept of autism as we know it now, but it was very different back then. Some of the things with autism that people have cited, sensory issues, like there could be very hypersensitive to things, socialization issues where it makes it harder for them to make friends, makes it harder to interact with others, the pragmatics, the other things like that, executive functioning issues where, again, it was harder for people with autism to organize and think more concretely. And they were not into the traditional youth things and toys, but sometimes had unusual interests. I'll just tell you from my own background having autism, I was very into technology as a kid and traffic signs and scoreboards and all sorts of other weird things. But every person was different. Go to our next slide here. The rise in autism has really risen. It was originally, I believe, about 1 in 20,000 back in the 1970s, and now it's like 1 in 58 today, according to the CDC. And there's a lot of debate over what's causing that. Some say it's the different testing practices. Of course, that's evolved over time. We now have the DSM-5, but back then the criteria was very different. More women and girls are being diagnosed. Others blame genetics, where they pass on from one person to another. And others, some of you believed it was the MMR vaccine, although that's been disproven. But that was the beliefs at the time. Again, there's a bunch of different things here that are changing the scope of autism. And then again, in girls, this is especially an interesting finding. I read a study from Italy where Patiago that they said that it was that the people test very differently on some of the factors of the diagnostic tests than boys do. So again, that's leading to a disproportionate number. And a lot of the early research on this happened to be focused on young boys. Again, one of the people quoted, they never found an adult with autism back in the day. And again, that was another interesting finding, but they're out there. The original autism belief system derived from schizophrenia. Part of the reason is because a lot of the doctors, and and Kanner and Asperger, were originally studying schizophrenia. So again, they thought it had some overlap between autism and schizophrenia with cognitive and social and memory. But later studies showed that there was only about 9% of people with autism actually experience schizophrenia. So it's a different category. And the symptoms are different because autism, you don't usually get hallucinations and other types of things like that. Whereas autism is more behavior oriented, more. So let's go on to the next one. One of the first therapies for autism was electric shock. This came from Ivar Lovis and Loretta Bender, and there were other promoters of it. So basically, it was a device that shocks your body with high voltage. So it was a calming way of doing it, but on the other hand, shock really damages your muscles and can even kill people. And then in other times, the shocks were being used for compliance. One of the most controversial schools that was still in operation until it still is, and they used to do shock up to this year still, 2020, the Judge Rotenberg Center in Canton, Massachusetts, until things. And I've seen some video from YouTube. You can go on YouTube and see some of the video compiled by a former employee of people being shocked, and it's just very tragic. One of the articles I read gives some response from what it was like from Jennifer Masumba. I've actually met her, by the way, and seen some of her videos as well on this. And that shock causes people to get hurt. And it really was bad, but it was innovative for the time, I will say that. But back then they knew nothing about electrical safety till recently. Another discredited theory that was promoted in the 50s and 60s, they actually promoted this to my mom, was refrigerator mothers. And this was the concept that the mother could not handle a bright child. They failed to make bonding. They failed to do this. And this came from a guy named Bruno Bettelheim. And Bruno was a guy who believed in racism. He believed in eugenics. He believed in sending people to an orthogenic school if they can't do it, which is probably very segregated with a very Protestant lifestyle from what I read. They actually said this theory to my own mom back in the day when I was diagnosed. She did not believe it. She got another opinion. But it was awful that they did this and did not acknowledge the disability. Again, the idea was to hide it, and it was pretty awful theory. So people form like the Autistic Society and the National and the Autism Society and some of the other advocacy groups. There was also TASH was formed in this era. There was a lot of during the 60s and 70s. The parents were sick of eugenics. They were sick of institutionalization. So they were looking for alternatives in policy. And and one of the interesting ones was Teach to focus on it was made by Lobos and Eric Schopler, where they would come there and get to learn and be taught and trained, which was much more humane. It wasn't perfect, and there's still a big debate over whether ABA is force or applied behavior analysis is force versus good therapy or not. And but Lovos did found that concept. Um, and then also there was a lot of research that started up in the thing of that era about, especially in the 80s, about what is the cause of autism. And I'll go over some of that with you in a minute here. But it's really, and there was also a big quest in the 1970s to reopen the public schools for people with disabilities, including autism, although that did not get added to the categories list till 1990, but there was still a thing to reopen the public schools so persons with disabilities could go to school with their peers. Of course, it wasn't perfect and some things were segregated, and I was in some of those classes back in the day, but yes, getting into the public schools, a lot of them did not take people with disabilities before 1975 when the Pennsylvania Arc of Pennsylvania versus the which is Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens. I hate using that term, but that's what they were called back then. Versus the Commonwealth, and then another case called Mills versus Board of Education. Eleanor Elkin said, one of the advocates for the ARC said after Brown versus Board of Education, she knew she could win this lawsuit, and that led to the first version of what we call IDEA now, but it was the Education of Handicapped Children Act back then, and so forth. So the next thing here is controversy is the MMR vaccine. This is still controversy over this is still going on between pro-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. But I will separate the facts from fiction here. First of all, Andrew Wakefield did a study that he saw that there was a lot of issues with the bowels and other things and he also was investigating the number of parents that said shortly after getting the MMR dose, their child started exerting symptoms of severe autism. And so we investigated this and noticed that there were some subgroups that were experiencing reactions to vaccines. And the study ended up getting retracted based on other evidence and other studies that said there was no harm at all. Even recently on CBS News Australia, I watched on YouTube, Wakefield was still listening and had a lot of hands grow up in how many have had autism right after getting the vaccine. So there is a debate here, even though the CDC and all their evidence studies show that there's no connection at all, and that's the accepted side of the medical community, and they ended up suspending Wakefield's license. But on the other hand, I dug a little deeper into what's called the VAERS database of actual vaccine injuries from the CDC, and I searched, and there's a category called autism and another one called autism spectrum disorder. The injuries, search on that, and I got over 1,900 hits. So again, there's evidence on both sides here. I'm not going to specify one way or another. Generally, it's debunked that there's no cause, but even Wakefield is not anti-vaccine, as some people say. He thinks splitting them up might be better for sensitive immune systems, rather than 3 vaccines in the same shot, to do one at a time. So there's just really interesting. I don't think there's a direct connection to the cause, but at the same time, I don't believe that vaccines are 100% risk-free either. There was a bunch of neurological research that happened in the 1980s going up through today. Things like the cerebellum they found is a little different, and the hippocampus and the frontal lobe. I've actually had my brain, my own brain analyzed at Brain Treatment Center up in Newport Beach, and I had some differences, some inactivity in some areas, and one of the other things, evidence that was coming out is there's different communications between the lobes that aren't happening as much in autism. So again, I believe that it may be that some of the reaction times are different because of compensation between things. That's just my own hypothesis, but some of the evidence and the research gives that idea as well. The other big thing is autism. The definitions have become more and more inconsistent over the years. And originally, it was meeting the criteria of some of the authors, like Kanner syndrome. I remember when I was a little boy, there was a big debate between Kanner syndrome and Asperger syndrome, because again, Asperger and Kanner had different ideas as to what autism is. But then American Psychological Association took over and revised this several times as well through the different DSM things. Like DSM, before DSM-3, there was no autism at all in the DSM. So if you got diagnosed, it was based on some of the original discoverers of autism. And then the DSM-3 called it pervasive developmental disorder. And again, it was a very limited criteria of symptoms that relate to that. And then DSM-3R comes out and with a different set, very similar, but adds some categories according to what I remember from when I was a child, to that and stuff. And then DSM-4 does it in different ways, from pervasive developmental disability to Asperger's to autism to something developmental thing to Rett syndrome, etc. And then they all combine it in DSM-5 under autism spectrum disorder, and which means it's a very wide range. There are people that are very advanced at things, and then people who don't speak. So it's a very big range. That's why it's called a spectrum. And then the last piece is what's called the neurodiversity movement. And it's about being accepted as who you want to be, who you really are. Not about fixing you or training you unless you want to be trained. It's not about forcing things with ABA. It's about reducing ableism and gaslighting people. And it's about acceptance throughout society, and 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 awareness is part of that, but it goes further in the sense that, oh, you want to be okay. It's okay to have autism. It's okay to have a disability. It's not like you want to be cured or changed. It's about accepting, and others accept you for who you really are, your character, what you contribute to society, um not be seen as a liability, not be seen as a bad person. It's about acceptance and 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 giving people the same level of respect that they would get without a disability. So in closing, I want to make sure that people understand how autism has changed over the years, and we've moved from a medical model to a social model, and we're opening more and more doors every day as we learn about this. And I don't, it's not something that will ever be cured, but at the same time, people can live quality lives with it and be given the chance if people just show respect for disability. Thank you.